I've given a lot of thought to killing myself over the course of my life. That is, in a very abstract sense. It's always held a certain romantic fancy to me. It's always been tinged with a sort of inexplicable, morbid idealism that I really can't quite understand. I feel that this is probably not an altogether unusual occurrence, especially among young people. But for me, suicide has always been abstract and almost ideological. The thought of literally going through with the physical act repels me instantaneously, and that romantic whiff uh, wears off very quickly when the thought of doing the deed itself comes into my mind, and I lose also my will to do that sort of thing becomes very impotent, and I don't think I have a will to actually do it. But contemplating the idea, suicide as a pure thought, um, is something that fascinates me, and I'd like to touch on that if, for a moment, and think about the aesthetics of suicide, not the ethics of suicide. That's been covered many times. I think uh, any reasonable person, should agree that a person, if they have any rights at all, first among them is control over their own body, and thus control over whether or not to terminate their life. At the same time, it's a sort of murky question. I think killing oneself, with the exception of a few rare circumstances, that might be the most self-indulgent act one can indulge in. It's really the ultimate act of, and the ultimate denial of responsibility, effectively abandoning your loved ones to a lifetime of psychological wounds that will never properly heal, and it's fleeing uh, all the importance of dealing with those problems yourself, and casting them onto others to wrestle with for the rest of their lives. But that's neither here nor there, really. Um, as I said, I'm interested in the aesthetics of suicide, the art of suicide, if you will. And there's a couple, two specific um, points of view I'd like to bring up here. That is, suicide as the ultimate denial of life, and suicide as the ultimate affirmation of life. Now, as for the latter, I think it was the affirmation of life. I'd like to just think about Albert Camus very briefly, and he famously discusses the issue of suicide um, in his existential essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, where he very plainly states in his opening line that the question of suicide is the only truly serious philosophical problem, because it is uh, the way one answers this question presupposes all other philosophical questions. That is, whether or not life is or is not worth living, whether or not existence is or is not meaningful to him. That is the first and foremost question of questions. And for Camus, in his absurdist, quasi-existentialist philosophy of life, he conceives of the universe as absurd, or man as an absurd creature who is trapped or just born into this world which has no direct, tangible meaning, no meaning which he can observe, no coherent order to his life uh, as an objective, um, ultimate, an ultimate objective basis on which on which he can live it and base all of his actions. And for Camus, the confrontation of this absurdity, this uh, formless void, that is human life, is man's greatest task, and he has to face it head on, and he has to make sense of the chaos, confront it successfully, and assign purpose where there is none. That, for Camus, is life's greatest goal and life's noblest achievement, to become your own God, in a sense, to become the sole arbiter of meaning and reason and purpose in your life, to make the direction of your life solely dependent upon how you live it. I think I've actually touched on this before when I discussed Heidegger. There's similar feelings here espoused, and Camus has a very noble and empathetic way of discussing these things and bringing them to light. And he uses that famous allegory of the king Sisyphus, who was condemned for eternity to roll this boulder up and down this hill, which would inevitably fall back down whenever he came close to reaching the top. And this was his absurd struggle. And Camus famously asserts in the final sentence or so of his essay that the struggle itself is enough to raise one's spirits to the heights, or words to that effect, and one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And so for Camus, the struggle that is life, that is struggling against the absurdity of a lack of inherent purpose and creating that purpose through your life, is his purpose, is his happiness, and ultimately is his fulfillment. So suicide for Camus becomes the ultimate denial of this responsibility and purpose, and an abandonment of the essence of life. So for Camus, suicide denies oneself this godlike ability to determine oneself and give meaning to oneself, independent of all outside authority. And a slightly different perspective on this, the opposite perspective on this, I find very fascinating, is Dostoevsky's take on suicide within the context of one of his novels, one of his greatest novels, called The Possessed.